Hello everyone, my name is Kevin Sass. I'm the winemaker here at Halter Ranch. We are located in our library back here and deep down in the caves, about 50 feet underground. And today we're going to be doing a video mainly about wine storage and aging. When you're storing wine for aging purposes, you want to keep your red and your whites basically ideally as close to 58 degrees Fahrenheit as possible. And I'll explain why in a second. Now, when you're going to do that, the important thing is to basically find a place in your house, preferably a cave like this, but I'm sure most of you don't have a cave like this. The next best option would be a wine cabinet, if you can buy one, a bigger one that fits inside your closet, or even go to Costco or some of those places, look online at Vino Temp, and you can buy a smaller unit that's maybe 50 bottles or so that you can store inside your closet or even in your kitchen. Those all work because the most important thing you have going on is that you want to maintain that 58-degree temperature. Now, I know that's not feasible for everybody, and some people say, well, I have it in my basement or I have it in my closet, and those all do work as well, because what it comes down to is you really want to avoid fluctuations of temperature. So if you have a closet that is in the back of your house and it's basically staying 58, 60, 62 degrees year round, and it's staying that way, then that can work as well. You're not going to meet the peak temperature, which is really 58 or lower, but it does happen, and I understand that. And it's not going to ruin your wine. It's just going to shorten the longevity of that wine a little bit, and again, I'll explain why. Now, when I say that and I talk about reds and whites being at 58 degrees Fahrenheit, I'm not talking about serving temperature. Those are two different things, and that's a whole nother video. Strictly for aging purposes, you want to be at 58 degrees Fahrenheit, so find a closet, find a wine cabinet, find a place where you can maintain that temperature, but the refrigerator is not one of them. You do not want to go to the 38 to 40 degree range. You want to be basically between 52 and 58 if possible, and again, in a spot where you're not going to see fluctuations where you're going to go from 52 to 68 back down to 52, okay? So that's the temperature and spots you want to store your wine. That's the first thing you need to attack when it comes to storing wine. Great, so now you've figured out where your best storage is going to be for you individually, and I want to talk a little bit more about the 58 degree mark and why that's so important. As you know, we're 58 degrees or lower inside this cave right now year round. That's the advantage of being underground. But 58 degrees is kind of a magic number for two different reasons. This bottle of wine that you see here, you can see it's got wine in it. In this little space right here, you have what's called headspace, which is basically a spot where you can get oxygen in and out that comes from the cork, and we'll talk a little bit about that with your storage here in a second. But 58 degrees is a temperature that Acetobacter, which is a spoilage organism that basically turns wine into vinegar. And Acetobacter does not like temperatures that are cold. Okay, so it's been scientifically proven through UC Davis and other places that Acetobacter doesn't generally like to grow at 58 degrees or lower. Okay, so if you can keep your wine at 58 degrees, red or white, you are limiting the Acetobacter reproduction and preventing your wine from ultimately turning into vinegar, also helping it in the aging process. So you can understand why that temperature is important. Now again, you don't want to go dramatically up from that. If you go up to 60, 62, 64, it's not the end of the world. It just means it's going to shorten the lifespan, because if that Acetobacter starts to grow, what happens is it will basically turn the wine into vinegar. Now, this won't happen in a day, or even a night or a week, or even probably a year. But over time, it's going to thrive and produce the same characters that you can get from vinegar, which is nail polish and some of those other things that you can smell. So long story short, the cooler the better. Again, you're not going to go below 52, and you're not going to put it in a refrigerator, but if you can keep it at 58 or lower, that is advantageous, and that's why those wine cabinets are so beneficial. And closets, they work, but not, or basements, they work, but not in the same way, because you do get fluctuations. So ideally 58 or lower, 52 to 58, try to find a wine cabinet, but let's try to find that 58 number if you're going to store your wines. Now that you've found your 58 degree temperature, let's talk a little bit about storing wines. And again, this goes for red and white. What happens during the bottling process is you basically are filling the bottles with wine that you see in front of us here. And once the wine is in the bottle, what happens is you go through and they have a little machine that pulls what's called negative pressure. So this small gap that you see between the wine and the cork has negative pressure in it, okay? They put the cork in, and what that means is that if your wine was to heat up and expand, the negative pressure accepts that, okay? The only problem with that negative pressure is it only lasts, 3 to 4 weeks, maybe 2 months or so, and then it basically equilibrates out. Okay, so now all of a sudden this is basically a equilibrium and you have the same amount of pressure on the inside and the outside of the bottle, okay? So a little bit about the storage of these things. Most of the wines that you're gonna age, whether they're red or white, generally have a cork finish, okay? And so what I have here is a cork, okay? And this cork is made of wood, okay? It comes from a cork tree largely produced in Portugal, okay? And this is also porous, okay? So what happens is you're going to get oxygen that's going to come through and it's going to work its way all the way through this cork, and you're going to get oxygen from inside the bottle or air from inside the bottle that's also going to work its way out. It's basically like a little vessel. But remember, this is in parts per billion, the amount of oxygen that's flowing through here. So it's a very, very slow process. So what's important here is that this is made of wood, and this will eventually dry out if you don't keep it wet. Okay, and I think some people have probably noticed with some of their wines, and you all know that storing wine upright like this is not the proper way to store it. And the reason why is because if you store it like this, okay, you will notice that the wine is constantly in contact with that cork, and that keeps the cork wet, and therefore it keeps it from drying out, okay? If you store a wine like you have here in front of me, the wine is not touching that cork. This cork will eventually dry out, and larger amounts of oxygen will flow through here, eventually producing more acetobacter and turning your wine into vinegar at a faster rate. And now I am talking about weeks, months, less than a year, this wine will go bad. So storing your wine in a horizontal position and keeping that cork wet is intrinsically important to the aging process. So please make sure wherever your storage unit is, you have the ability to lay these wines down. Now it's time to talk about what actually happens in the bottle during the aging process. So let's take a look at this right here. Cork staying wet, as you can see here, okay? And now, as we discussed before, you basically have oxygen that is going through this cork, and it's slowly getting into this wine. And I know how we talked that that's necessarily usually a bad thing, but again, you're talking about parts per billion, and this is the process of aging wine. This is what's important, and this is what creates aged wines, okay? So, to talk a little bit about it, basically you have what's called a maturation process, and when that oxygen goes into that wine, it essentially polymerizes things, specifically color, tannin molecules, oak tannin molecules, grape tannin molecules, all those things, and it changes the flavor profile of the wine, okay? And what happens is it basically goes through, and as that polymerization takes place, you get more and more changes in flavor. It becomes more mature. And it's also something you can't go back on. A kind of a simple, funny analogy would be, like my hair, right? When I was younger, I was, kind of this sandy blonde, turned a little darker, through a little bit of time, and as time goes on, it continues to get a little bit more silver, and now it's almost completely silver, okay? Some people like things one way, and some people like things the other way, and it's the same thing with wine. And that's what you have to understand when you're aging a wine, okay? You put this wine down, you try it today, you try it in 20 years, it's definitely not going to be the same. It's going to be different, it's going to be mature, it's going to have evolved, and sometimes for better and sometimes for worse. And there is no exact right answer on when to pull it. It's all subjective. So everybody has to understand when you ask somebody, when you ask a winemaker, how long will this last? Well, this wine will last 20 years, but it doesn't mean you're going to necessarily like it better in 20 years. You might like it better at the 10-year mark or the 5-year mark, or you might even like it better when you first opened it, okay? But it's the point of all this is to have fun with wine, have fun with a bottle that's been around for 20 years, sometimes older than your kids or what you were doing 20 years ago, and just have an experience with it. And that's what aging wine is all about. The next step is to discuss red and whites and how they differ during the aging process. With red wines, you obviously have color, and a major part of that color is what we call phenolics. Very complex term. I'm not going to bore you with the details, but essentially those are the things that help the aging process. And with those things present, with those phenolics present, which is color, tannin levels, basically what happens is that allows the wine to last longer. They're kind of the antioxidants is really what they are. So a little bit of oxygen goes into those things. Like I said before, the tannins polymerize, the color polymerizes, that's what creates the sediment in your red wine. And so red wines can essentially evolve and last longer because of those phenolics, those color components, those tannin components. When we talk about white wines, it's quite different. White grapes do not generally have tannins in their skins. There's a few that do, but also during the winemaking process, you don't have those skins in tanks, so you don't generally extract the tannin levels and some of the phenolics that come in white wine. So what you're doing when you're aging white wine is you're basically letting the oxygen in parts per billion and creating a slight oxidation effect, okay? And so what's good to understand about whites is that what you're doing is you're changing the flavor profile through a bit of oxidation, which is why when you have, for example, our Grenache Blanc, you're gonna see basically white flower characters up front and initially, and they're gonna evolve into flavors of like honey, a little bit of maderization, a little bit of just kind of flavors that are a little bit riper. You might get more riper cantaloupe and riper honeydew in that capacity. If you were to talk about Chardonnay, you know, it's basically strictly apple, right? You might have a real crisp, refreshing Chardonnay, you wait 10 years and it turns into this oxidized apple character, okay? So that's why, you know, whites, you generally don't age quite as long. They still can age and there's no problem with that. Just understand that your flavor evolution is gonna go from, you know, kind of fresh to oxidized, okay? Now with the reds, you can age them for a long time because they do have those phenolics. And what I always suggest to people is if you really like a wine now and you think that it's got the potential to last, it's got a lot of body, a lot of structure to it, you know, the best thing is to really buy a case of that wine or 6 bottles of that wine, try one right away, try one a year later, you know, try one 4 years after that. So you've got, you know, release 1 year into it, you know, 6 years into it. And if you still think that wine is holding on and it's got longer to go, then let it go to 10 and try it again. And if at that point, if you feel that that wine has hit its peak, then drink it up. That's the best way to go. You know, find something you really like, you know, buy a case of it, buy 6 bottles of it, and watch it. And when it's at its peak, then drink it. Drink it with your friends, throw a party, you know, have a good time with it. Because again, we're always making more. How do you know if you have a problem with the wine that you've stored? That's a great question that people always ask. They have questions about things that they see that don't make a lot of sense to them, or is this wine still good? Is this wine still bad? So here's a couple things to look for when you're storing wine, you know, whether or not you have it like our Thor Mountain Cabernet that does not have a foil, or this 2015 Tempranillo that does have a foil. And by the way, foils are essentially irrelevant. They don't store any oxygen in or out. So this bottle right here is going to age the same way this bottle is. This foil originally was put in place for tampering way long time ago. Obviously now a lot of people with sustainability are pulling away from foils. We are too, because they really don't serve a purpose besides just packaging. A couple red flag things to look for. If you have a bottle of wine like this Thor Mountain Cabernet and you see this cork any higher than the top of the bottle, that's an immediate sign that the bottle has a slight problem. And generally speaking, what it means is that this wine warmed up and the wine expanded and it pushed the cork out slightly. And ideally, if you have it in your storage unit, then you put it in a cold temperature, the wine contracted back down, but the cork's not gonna come back down, okay? Because it's too snug tight in there. So that's an initial sign that the wine warmed up too fast. In that situation, what I would suggest doing is go ahead and pop it and try it. If you like it, drink it. You know, there's really not much you can do. If it got too hot, then it would matterize, you would taste it, it wouldn't taste good. You know, things happen. It either got left in the trunk of your car or your air conditioning unit turned off. You know, unfortunately, that's the way things go. Another sign would be looking at the corks. What I've got here is I've got a good cork and a bad cork, okay? So you're gonna look at this and you can see that there's a streak right up the side of this cork. Again, that would be another sign that the wine warmed up, and instead of the cork pushing out, what happened is the wine just slid up the side, okay? Again, that's not necessarily means that the wine is terrible and that it's done for, but what it does mean is that the wine got warm and then contracted back down and the wine spilled out the top, okay? So the cork wasn't sealed quite enough and it found a path of least resistance and went out the top. A lot of times you will see the top of the cork that looks like that because the wine came out and went on top of it, okay? This is what a good cork looks like, where you can see there's nothing around it, no leakage whatsoever, okay? Nothing on the top. This is red because this was facing where the wine was, you know, sitting in the bottle like this, okay? So again, those are a couple red flags to look for. With that, you know, again, if you find those two things, the best thing to do is just pull the wine right away, try it. If you like it, drink it. If it is off, then unfortunately you got to pour it out and you lost a bottle. You know, but hey, that's what happened with storing wine. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, but usually that's not an issue. If you get it direct from the winery, it's always the safest thing because we store it in caves and places like this. And if you can go straight into your cellar, again, try not to go into the trunk of your car and then go to another winery, let it get up to 80 degrees. That's when this type of thing will happen. So there's a couple red flags to keep your eye out for, but aging is fun. I hope you enjoyed this video. Hopefully you gathered a lot of information here, get a better understanding of how to age wines. Just also remember, storing and aging wine and pulling wines from your cellar is always an experience, right? It's a journey. You know, be happy with what happened. It's just wine. It's always supposed to be fun. You know, that's what we do here. We try wines that are, you know, 10, 15 years old and just are amazed. The fact that they're that old and still holding up is, you know, what's so cool about wine in general, and how they all change, right? They're like kids. They're always evolving, always changing. It's supposed to be fun, so have fun with it. I hope you liked the video. If there's anything else that you want to hear more about, please let us know. We'd love to make some videos and help educate you, and we appreciate your time. So enjoy your aged wine. Cheers.